Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to CorpusCast with me, Dr. Robbie Love. This is the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. Welcome once again. Today, we're dialing back the clock to better times and wrapping ourselves in the warm, fuzzy blanket of nostalgia. Specifically, how corpus linguistics is helping researchers to better understand the role of nostalgia in contexts like public discourse, not just because it feels nice to take a gentle stroll down memory lane, but potentially it's a powerful persuasive technique. So to take me on a sepia-toned sentimental journey through the language of nostalgia, I'm lucky to be joined by not one but two guests today, both of whom I've been hoping to have on the show for quite some time, so I'm very glad that we finally made it happen. My first guest is Charlotte Taylor, Professor of Discourse and Persuasion in the Department of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Sussex. Charlotte's research interests are in the analysis of language as used for evaluative and persuasive purposes, and she's worked extensively in the context of political and media discourse with interests ranging from impoliteness, migration discourses, science communication in the press, metaphor, and methods in corpus and discourse analysis. And her books include Patterns and Meaning in Discourse and The Language of Persuasion in Politics. And she has a long-running collaboration with our other guest today, leading to publications including their co-edited book, Corpus Approaches to Discourse, A Critical Review. Not much more of a hint that you need if you're familiar with that particular book. I'm also joined by Anna Marchi, Senior Assistant Professor in the Department of Interpreting and Translation at the University of Bologna. Anna's research interests include corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, research methods, news and political discourse, and journalism studies. And in 2019, Anna published the book Self-Reflexive Journalism, a corpus study of journalistic culture and community in The Guardian. Anna is Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Corpus and Discourse Studies, of which Charlotte is also an editor. Aside from all of that, none of which we're really going to talk about, actually, today our focus is on Charlotte and Anna's most recent work on the topic of nostalgia, specifically their project Media Narratives of Nostalgia, an investigation of emotions, storytelling, and newsworthiness using corpus. So, without further ado, please welcome our guests to the show, Charlotte Taylor and Anna Marchi. Hello, both, and welcome to CorpusCast.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you both. As I said, I've been hoping to have you on for some time, and I'm so glad that we found a time to make this recording. So thanks again. We're going to dive in, of course, with the question I always ask my guests to kick things off. And Charlotte, I'll put you in the hot seat first to ask, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think we're quite good at being reflexive in corpus linguistics, but we don't often stop and think about exactly what it is that we're doing, maybe. So I think probably someone who, when I hear, assertions made and claims made, the first question I tend to think is, how do we know that? And so I suppose at the most basic level, corpus linguistics is just a way of being able to answer that question of, how do we know that? So this week I was asked something that's much more your area of expertise, Robbie, which was, has swearing increased? And, the obvious way of addressing that would be, well, let's go and have a look at some data and then see whether it's increased or not. So I think that's kind of the first thing of what corpus linguistics means. But I'd hope it's also a way of seeing something different, rather than just more of the same. And I was really struck by something Susan Hunston said in one of her plenaries, which was that corpus linguistics software rearranges the data so you can see the patterns that are latent within it. So it's just sort of restructuring how we look at it to see something different.
And sticking with you, Charlotte, for now, this is something that I always find fascinating, people's journeys into doing research in corpus linguistics. Give me a bit of your own sort of academic background and specifically, at what point did you come to realize that this is something that you were interested in pursuing as your research career?
Yeah, it's a very circuitous route, I would say. So my undergraduate degree was literature. So, you know, I was interested in language, but from a very different perspective. And then, like quite a lot of people probably, I thought I'd have a year out when I graduated before I went on to do a master's. So I did the CELTA to train to teach English, and then I went and taught English. And I was expecting to do it for a year. It was just a way of, you know, being in Italy and working there. And then, of course, once you start teaching and then your students start asking these brilliant and very difficult questions, you know, then you realise that language is so much more interesting and complex than maybe you were first thinking. So, yeah, I think that was kind of my entry point into really thinking about language, not in terms of, you know, looking at literature, but just language itself. And, you know, also realising that we didn't know the answer to so many questions that I was being asked. I think that was really great.
And at what point did you first encounter specifically corpus linguistics? Who was it? Who and where and in what context were you introduced to that?
Yeah, well, this is probably the same part as Anna's in that it was Professor John Morley at the University of Siena. So I was working then as an English language lecturer. And he said to me one summer, would I like to work on a project looking at courtroom discourse? And it was basically preparing a corpus. And then, yeah, it was really fascinating. That's when I got into impoliteness and aggression, obviously looking at the courtroom discourse. But yeah, getting familiar with the tools of corpus linguistics and realising that actually it could start to answer lots of the questions that students had had when I've been teaching as well. So yeah, it was really that Siena base that got me into corpus linguistics.
And of course, you're now at the University of Sussex. How long have you been based at Sussex?
About 10 years now, which surprises me every time I say it. It still feels like a couple of years, but yeah.
And you've done your PhD at Lancaster as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I did my PhD part-time and distance, which was a shame because I would have loved to be at Lancaster more. It's such a brilliant place to be. But it was a really great place for me. So I was combining my interest in impoliteness and language aggression, working with Jonathan Culpeper and applying corpus linguistic tools to that. So, yeah, it was a really great experience.
And Anna, of course, I'll turn to you. And we, in fact, I think the three of us have that particular thing in common, at least of doing our PhDs at Lancaster, which is a theme that perhaps unsurprisingly has emerged with a few guests who either on the podcast who either work there or have worked there or studied there at one point. So I'll ask you the same question. I'm interested in your perspective and how closely aligned to Charlotte's thoughts on corpus linguistics you are as well. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Well, you know, Robbie, I'm a big fan of your show. And this part that you ask is always my favorite because, that was such a great answer. And then I thought, what would my answer be? And I thought about it for a while, but only realized what it would be this morning. I thought the great thing really for me about corpus linguistics is surprise. So the fact that you can so often say, I didn't know that. Well, I didn't expect that. And it sort of gives you a variety of, not just one different perspective, but a variety of different perspectives. So Charlotte often calls it looking from many windows. And I agree, it's very much that. So the great thing is that we're stuck with ourselves most of the time, actually all of the time. And corpus linguistics sort of gives you the chance to suspend your own point of view and unsettle habits. Just look at things from a perspective that you wouldn't or couldn't have, simply because that's not how our brain works, but that's how a computer would let you see things. So it's the idea of change and being given the chance to explore more than yourself. So multiplicity in a way that I like as an experience of corpus linguistics.
I'll ask you the same as well. I'm always curious about at what point you discovered linguistics and specifically corpus linguistics. So what was your journey into the sort of research that you do now?
Okay, I was supposed to be a journalist in the sense I've always wanted to be a journalist. And I studied journalism. I went to grad school to study journalism. And I met Charlotte in Siena while I was in media studies when John Morley was my supervisor for my thesis. And I've always also been a word nerd. So, but the two things kind of didn't meet until John offered me a job tagging corpora, so compiling and tagging corpora. So I did a little bit of research during my BA working on journalistic corpus, but then I went back to journalism and was determined to do that. And eventually coming back from the United States where I was, when I started grad school for journalism, and I had no job, and I was offered to do that. And it happened, and I was fascinated by it. But it's also when Charlotte and I started working together, that goes like about 20 years ago, something like that. Sorry, but it is.
I want to ask you about that in a moment, but I just want to pick up on your introduction to corpus linguistics was being asked to do some tagging. Was that manual tagging or?
Yeah, it was actually transcribing television news. So it was BBC and CBS were transcribing and manually annotating for speakers' turns and things like that. So very careful manual tagging of news.
Wow. And that wasn't enough to put you off. I'm amazed.
No, I actually love that kind of thing. I still do when I'm nervous. That's best practice.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you've known each other for I'll sort of mouth it about 20 years now. And that was in Siena, right? That was how you first came to know each other?
Yeah.
And at what point did you, because you have, I mentioned a couple of your publications at the beginning, but you have collaborated on several projects now at this point over the years. At what point did your kind of research, how do I say it, partnership, I suppose, sort of you became regular collaborators. At what point did you realize, maybe there's something we can work together on? What was the beginning of that for you?
I think it probably just came out of talking about the projects we were working on. And I think we were both interested in those kinds of theoretical methodological issues of what are we doing when we do this? And so that's when we did the paper together on a winter's night, where we were looking at, sort of triangulation and playing around with those sorts of things.
And
we've been consistent collocates ever since.
Oh, I love it. I said, I think there's a T-shirt in that or something. Maybe we should have branding for the next Corpus Linguistics conference or something. Yes, I may note that down. You give me an idea. We'll start to sort of move on to, I was about to say delve, but then you might think I'm reading off of a ChatGPT generated script. I'm going to avoid saying delve. Instead I'll say dive. We'll dive into the topic of nostalgia. And I want to start with I suppose the obvious question, because it's not something that I'd previously seen really discussed too explicitly, specifically in corpus linguistics research, too often thinking about nostalgia from a linguistic perspective. But in general, what is your sort of working definition of what do we mean when we're actually talking about nostalgia?
Well, that's, I think, anything but obvious, in the sense it's most difficult thing to do is give a definition of anything, really, because it depends on what you want to do with it afterwards. Yeah. But nostalgia, I would say it's particularly difficult because Craig Evans, whom I'm working with on a corpus of desert island discs, says nostalgia, you feel like you have understood what it is, but then it's elusive. It slips away the minute you think you've understood what it is. And I think it's quite right. So in the paper Charlotte and I presented last time, Corpus Linguistics, we sort of looked at nostalgia, looking at label nostalgia. So it's a bit getting to the definition of nostalgia depending on how it is discussed and how it is talked about or written about. And that would be one definition. But then there's, alongside nostalgia discourse, there would be nostalgic discourse. So we're describing what nostalgia does when we want to define it, or what nostalgia is as label. And I think we're trying to do a little bit both things, because one sort of is intricately intertwined with the other. So we say there's nostalgias rather than nostalgia. Most specifically, I think we can't get away from the distinction between more collective or historical nostalgia and personal nostalgia. And this because even in terms of the science behind it, there are two traditions. So there's people who have discussed about the negative aspect of nostalgia, this idea of manipulative or toxic nostalgia that sort of mythicize particular aspects of the past or imagined or real, and how dangerous that is, namely Brexit, Donald Trump, and populism in general, and all sorts of evils or reactionary politics that can happen. And then there's the psychological research that has been done on nostalgia, which is mainly about personal nostalgia, how nostalgia is good for you. But I think there is an overlap between this negative reputation and the good feeling that we understand nostalgia to be, because, well, it wouldn't be sellable if it didn't feel good. So there's sort of have to come together. So there's an interplay between the two. So when we define it in order to tackle it linguistically, we have to bear in mind that that distinction between, yes, the reflective and restorative, I think, would be the definition of Svetlana Boym, the scholar who all nostalgists go back to.
So we're sort of talking about this idea of looking back at the past sort of wistfully, and it seems from what you're saying that there are actually various functions of nostalgia, both sort of cathartic or within an individual experiencing nostalgia, but then of course the performance of nostalgia, and we'll get onto that side of the linguistic aspects. But what do you think? Maybe part of your work is to try and answer this question, at least from a linguistic perspective. But in general, what purpose? Why does nostalgia exist? What are the sort of broad functions, and how do you sort of begin to sort of try and tackle this kind of in terms of the way people talk, both, as you said, people talking about nostalgia, but then people performing nostalgia through talking about their own experience of it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really difficult to sort of say why do we have nostalgia, because that sort of goes beyond what we can reach through language analysis. But in terms of functions, I think it's much easier to identify those through the language analysis as well as the previous work. And I think exactly as Anna was saying, it really depends on which type of nostalgia we're talking about. So if you've got nostalgia in the sense of that kind of pang that you get when you smell something, and it just triggers this completely unprompted, very specific personal memory, is really different from that kind of commodified nostalgia that you get. So let's say you go to an event that's themed around a particular historical period, and you're really being heavily prompted to nostalgize about that moment as understood in that particular way. And then that, again, is quite different from the kind of nostalgia of the Make America Great Again, right? So I think these different forms of nostalgia have very different functions, and they vary according to that kind of individual versus social, political sort of function. But I mean, for me, one of the most interesting things about the function of nostalgia is that it has simultaneously two completely opposing functions if we're thinking of collective nostalgia. So on the one hand, there's a really substantial body of work, particularly from social psychology, showing how it has this very pro-social function. So if you get people to share a collective sense of nostalgia, essentially you're creating an imagined community. And then that community is likely to look after itself. So you get things like research that's been done on how establishing a sort of collective nostalgia increases empathy for people within that group who share that same nostalgic imagining. And therefore it'll increase charity contributions and things like this. So really sort of effective pro-social functions. But then at the same time, by creating these sort of collectives, what you're doing is also bordering, right? So at the same time as you have warmer sentiment towards people who are part of that collective group, you're likely to have some sort of antipathy or hostileness towards people who are outside that group. And then obviously in certain spheres that we'll probably talk about later, this gets leveraged very actively in order to create sort of more antisocial elements. And so to me, that sort of simultaneous pro-social, antisocial function, I think is really fascinating about it.
And this is really interesting because, Anna, you mentioned earlier the example of sort of populist rhetoric and potentially the quite persuasive power of what you're calling collective nostalgia, which I think intuitively is a really nice way of describing what we're talking about here. Is that specifically, is that the kind of context that, motivated you to start working together on nostalgia from a corpus perspective? Was it looking at, how powerful people and entities, how did it, to what extent and how do they use collective nostalgia in their public communicate? Was that kind of the spark that made you, there's something that we can do here? Or were you always interested, in nostalgia sort of more broadly anyway? What sort of led you to decide we're going to work together and try to see what corpus linguistics can contribute to investigating this particular issue?
Well, it wasn't for me, really. Charles came up with the idea of nostalgia, and I thought, that would be very difficult to study using corpus linguistics. And I like a challenge. So that was my main reason to get into nostalgia at all, was purely methodological. Then it's a fascinating topic. So it really grows on you because you start seeing it everywhere. So I don't know if it happens with anything you do, but it certainly did with nostalgia. It's popping out from every corner. So, but initially for me, it was exclusively methodological, like how can we possibly do this using corpora? Because you know that it's one of those things that are difficult to count that we like to try to count,
Yeah, I'll ask you about that in a moment because I sort of from the outside looking in at the issue of nostalgia, it sounds like something that would be quite tricky to investigate, and I do want to ask you about that. But I just want to pick up on something you said there, where suddenly you started noticing that you're seeing it everywhere around you. Tell me, either or both of you, please, tell me more about what you mean by that in the sense of where do you see it and how can you tell that it's nostalgia, in the sense that I'm assuming that this is largely implicit. I'm thinking about, maybe, I don't know, I'm assuming there's quite a lot of it in advertising, for instance, and marketing, right? Sort of getting people to look back on a previous segment, but they're not going to be telling you, I'm assuming, up front, this is our strategy and this is nostalgia. So how do you, start to sort of see it around you, and how pervasive do you think it is?
I mean, I could start with where I sort of got interested in nostalgia, which was really from working on migration discourses. And there it is very pervasive in all sorts of different ways. And I think, it's that thing, once you start seeing it, you start looking for it, I suppose, so you see it everywhere. But I mean, migration discourses, I didn't expect to end up looking at nostalgia when I was doing the project on migration discourses. And it really sort of came out of both things that were happening at the time. And, I was saying, I have this thing about somebody makes an assertion. I'm like, how do we know that? And it was sort of partly that around 2019, around the time of the Windrush scandal, if you remember that, it was when the government was surprised to learn, I think it's fair to say, that there was a lot of public outrage at the way their hostile environment policies had affected people who'd moved to the UK in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s. And their defence was always, we've always welcomed these people. We didn't mean them. We were trying to get these other ones, right? And so, immediately you're like, oh, really? Is that actually the case? And so when you've got the corpora, you can go back and look at the historical record and say, well, were these people welcomed at their point of arrival? And of course, the answer is no. They were described using exactly the same language that was used for the people who are described as illegalized immigrants today. And so that's sort of one of the things that comes up in migration discourses. So one is there's this sort of really powerful myth of we've always been a welcoming country. And because we've always been a welcoming country, we can be hostile now without a negative evaluation of us. It's just a very clever sort of rhetorical move. So you've got that element of nostalgia. But I think there's also this sort of broader myth of migration, which relies on nostalgia, which is that there is an us group who is intrinsically different from the out group of migrants, and the we group is static and homogeneous. And of course, you can only maintain that myth if you basically erase all past migration, as they have this kind of nostalgia around there being this sort of constant stasis of the us group, and you get rid of everything else. So I think nostalgia is really powerful in migration discourses, and they're just sort of two examples of it. And that's how I started seeing it elsewhere.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is, really sort of very much on the outside looking in, as I said, but from what you're saying, it sounds like nostalgia isn't just about getting people to look back to, in reality, how things used to be and real memories of what things actually were like, but also to encourage myth making in a way of an imagined past. Would you consider that all just nostalgia, or do we have kind of two different subtypes, I guess, of nostalgia? One which is remember when this thing that was actually real was happening, and wasn't it better, or whatever, or encouraging, as you said, sort of creating a fake or false nostalgia of a past that didn't actually exist, to persuade people to take on a certain position.
I mean, I think that's part of why nostalgia is so persuasive, right? Is that, it can be personal, but we know that memory is a very slippery thing, and the things we think we remember, we might not experience. But, people have nostalgia for their own past, but they have nostalgia for past that they never experienced. So, like people who are, I don't know, in their 20s, going along to a revival event celebrating the 40s. Yeah. So they have no personal experience of that, but they have this nostalgia for the time. And they have nostalgia for that. Sorry?
There's even a word for that.
Of course.
It's called anemoia. So it's nostalgia for things you've never experienced.
Yeah. Oh, anemoia.
Yeah. And then there's, nostalgia for things that never existed.
Yeah.
Like this kind of mythical green land. A really good example, I think, is around language standards. That, every period of time has nostalgia for a time when language was better and it was done right. But if you go back and look at the language debates at that point in time, of course, they were saying, oh, no, it was that other time. And so, yeah, you absolutely have nostalgia for things that never existed or that you never experienced.
Yes, and by logical extension, if we carry on far enough back, we'll have people who'd only just started using language in the way we do, talking about, wasn't it great before language even existed? And we had to communicate in a way. It wasn't language that was better, it wasn't great before we even had it. Yeah, that is something that I find quite hilarious. You go back and you see, there's Twitter threads and stuff, people saying, well, 200 years ago, people were complaining about the youth ruining language, and we're still here. So, yeah. Anna, I want to ask, where else, you said, you start seeing it sort of everywhere. Where else are the sort of places that you're observing this, or is it easier to ask where don't you find it, I suppose?
For starters, an immense amount of books have been published only in the past couple of years on nostalgia. I mean, historians all of a sudden are focusing everything on nostalgia, and it's very much either a kind of rehabilitation of this negative view that has been the so-called traditional view in sociology or history of politics, where nostalgia is associated with unfactfulness and manipulation. But really what Charlotte was saying about the unfactfulness is both in the positive and in the negative views. Even neuroscientists who study nostalgia describe it as not autobiographical memory, but imagination. So it's more similar to imagination, really, than to actual memory. Other places I've seen it, music, revival. So this you go around and everything is a tribute concert to some. So, and it's probably it's probably happened before, because there's nothing new about that. It's very much the same. Now we claim to be in a specifically nostalgic age, but so they did about around the 1970s. It was the same. So there's always a nostalgic callback to nostalgic times themselves. So there's a bit of that. This
reminds me a bit of I studied about metaphor, but when I was an undergraduate, and from a linguistic perspective, and then sort of suddenly realized that almost all of language is metaphorical. So it's everywhere, and everything is in some way figurative, or will become figurative eventually. Is like, and then you sort of think it seems a similar sort of thing when as you said, Charlotte, when you start looking for something, you realize it's everywhere around you. I want to get into kind of some of the more.
Sorry, Rob, but this sort of makes a case for corpus linguistics in itself, because I know that it's not true that it's everywhere.
No.
It's just that I'm seeing it everywhere because I'm biased towards it.
Yes,
So-
exactly. We need something, I sometimes hesitate to say objective, because that is quite a maybe controversial claim to make in terms of just how objective corpus linguistics is, but it certainly is more objective than just sitting there and deciding for yourself, I suppose, without looking at any evidence. So let's talk about the evidence, the data. What kind of data are you looking at sort of currently, or have you been looking at recently in your work together on nostalgia? Tell us a little bit about the corpus data that you're looking at, and then I will ask you, how on earth do you actually look in the data for nostalgia? But I suppose we should set the scene a bit by talking a bit about what data sets you have that you're looking for nostalgia in at the moment.
Well, Charlotte and I worked together on diachronic corpora of newspapers and of Hansard, Parliament. And we looked at the label nostalgia and how it's been used, nostalgia and nostalgic, how they've been used diachronically from the 1950s up to today. And we used that data for, well, I suppose, two reasons. One is the main reason why we use any data in corpus linguistics, because it's available. There's a lot of it, and it's possible to do diachronic analysis. And since nostalgia is intrinsically about time, it seemed important to input the time into the question. So I did a little bit of more synchronic things before, but I think the diachronic element is very important, and also the fact that it's sort of two different aspects of public discourse, so media discourse and political discourse. And since the claim is that nostalgia has such a pervasive effect in terms of collective perception of reality, it seemed like a good place to look. Then we also
So the historical one, just to add, is I think the other thing is that because one of the really key things about nostalgia is that it's not about just looking back. It's about looking back to make a comment about the present or project something into the future, right? So what's really interesting about doing a diachronic study is you can look at, what are the things that we are supposed to be nostalgic about at different points in the past. And of course, those shift and they tell you something about the moment in which people are nostalgizing, because they're the things that are being picked up as being salient and missing from that moment.
Oh, so it's a window in a political context. It's a window through which, you can observe what leaders are telling people they should miss or should want.
Right. And what they're saying is missing from the present, but necessary for the present.
Yes.
Right.
That's very interesting. So I, in that context, you're looking for presumably you're searching for when people are actually saying the word nostalgia or nostalgic, right?
Yeah.
In order to find the kind of meta commentary in a way of talking about nostalgia, right?
Yeah, so it was kind of like the first stage of the project, was we start with how does the concept get named, and how is it used, and also, how is it used, for instance, in political debate to delegitimize other people's opinions. You're just being nostalgic. Your nostalgia is worthless and trivial and rose-tinted.